Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome to Her True Stories. This is Amelia Berry, and today I'm sharing the story of how I discovered my son-in-law's ultimate betrayal and how I made sure he paid for every single moment of pain he caused my daughter and unborn grandchild. The flight from Paris landed at JFK at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in October. I'd spent 3 months in Europe touring the galleries of Florence, sipping wine in Tuscany, finding myself again after 2 years of grief following my husband's death. At 59, I'd learned that healing sometimes requires distance, and the old world had a way of putting things into perspective. My driver collected me in the familiar black Mercedes, and as we pulled away from the airport, I felt that bittersweet mixture of jet lag and homecoming. My long silver-gray hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and I wore my favorite pearl necklace, the one Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary. Even after traveling for 15 hours, I maintained the composure that had served me well through decades of business dealings and social obligations. "Straight home, Mrs. Berry?" James asked, glancing at me in the rear-view mirror. "Actually, let's make a stop first. I want to surprise Isabella. My daughter lived in Westchester, about 40 minutes from my Manhattan penthouse. I hadn't told her I was coming home early. I'd wanted to surprise her and check on how she was managing in her 8th month of pregnancy. At 32, Isabella had always been independent to a fault, insisting she could handle everything herself, even when she clearly needed help. The October evening was crisp leaves just beginning to turn their autumn colors. As we wound through the tree-lined streets of Isabella's neighborhood, I felt a familiar maternal warmth. Soon I'd be holding my first grandchild, a little girl, according to the ultrasound Isabella had sent me while I was in Rome. But when we pulled into the circular driveway of the Tudor-style house that I'd helped Isabella and David purchase 3 years ago, something felt wrong. The house was completely dark. Every window, every room, nothing but black glass staring back at me. The lawn was overgrown and newspapers lay scattered across the front walkway like autumn leaves. My stomach clenched with the first whisper of panic. "Mrs. Berry?" James's voice carried concern. "Perhaps they're just out for dinner." I shook my head, already reaching for my phone. Isabella never left newspapers on the walkway. She was meticulous about appearances, just as I taught her, and she certainly wouldn't have let the landscaping go like this, especially not this close to the baby's due date. I dialed her number. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. Her cheerful voice recorded months ago felt like an echo from another lifetime. "Hi, you've reached Isabella. Leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." "Something's wrong," I told James, my voice steadier than I felt. "Drive to the hospital now." We tried northern Westchester first, then White Plains. At the 3rd hospital, Presbyterian Lawrence, the receptionist's face changed when I mentioned Isabella's name. "Are you immediate family?" she asked, her professional smile faltering. "I'm her mother. Please have a seat. I'll get Dr. Martinez." The 15 minutes I waited in that sterile lobby felt like hours. My hands, usually so steady in board meetings and business negotiations, trembled as I clutched my pearl bracelet. When Dr. Martinez finally appeared, a tired-looking woman in her 40s with kind eyes, I could read the gravity in her expression before she spoke a single word. "Mrs. Berry, I'm Dr. Martinez. Your daughter is in our ICU." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What happened?" "She was brought in 3 days ago by a neighbor who found her unconscious in her front yard. She'd collapsed from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and stress-induced complications. At 8 months pregnant, her condition was critical." 3 days. My daughter had been fighting for her life for 3 days, and I'd been sipping champagne at a bistro in Montmartre. The baby. We're monitoring both closely. Isabella is stable now, but it was touch and go for the first 48 hours. If Mrs. Henderson hadn't found her when she did, Dr. Martinez's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Can I see her? Of course, but I should prepare you. She's been unconscious since she arrived. We are hopeful she'll wake up soon, but her body has been through significant trauma. As we walked through the maze of hospital corridors, I forced myself to ask the question that had been burning in my throat since I saw the empty house. Where is her husband? Martinez stopped walking and turned to face me. In her eyes, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Pity mixed with disgust. We've been unable to reach Mr. Ashford. The staff has tried calling repeatedly, but his phone appears to be disconnected or out of service range. David Ashford, my son-in-law of 3 years, the man who'd sworn to love and protect my daughter through sickness and health, the man who charmed his way into our family with his easy smile and ambitious talk about his tech startup. Have you checked with his office? His business partner said he's been unreachable for over a week. Something about a business trip that got extended. We reached the ICU, and through the glass partition, I saw my daughter for the first time in 3 months. Isabella looked so small in that hospital bed, dwarfed by machines and monitors. Her usually lustrous dark hair hung limp against the pillow, and her skin had a pale, translucent quality that spoke of prolonged neglect. But it was her belly round and prominent beneath the hospital blanket that broke my heart completely. My grandchild fighting for life inside a mother who'd been abandoned when she needed protection most. I sat beside Isabella's bed and took her hand in mine. It felt cold, fragile, like porcelain that might shatter at the wrong touch. "I'm here now, sweetheart," I whispered. "Mama's here." For the next 4 hours, I didn't leave her side. I called my assistant, Margaret, and had her cancel everything: board meetings, charity commitments, social obligations. Nothing mattered except this room, this bed, this fight for survival that my daughter and grandchild were waging. At midnight, Dr. Martinez returned with an update. Her vitals are improving. We're cautiously optimistic that both she and the baby will pull through this. But Mrs. Barry, I need you to understand the level of stress and neglect that led to this collapse suggests ongoing problems at home. Has your daughter mentioned any difficulties in her marriage? I thought back to our phone calls over the past few months. Isabella had seemed tired sometimes, distracted, but she'd always insisted everything was fine. Now I wondered what she'd been hiding, what she'd been too proud or too afraid to tell me. She's always been private about personal matters, I said carefully. Dr. Martinez nodded. When she wakes up, she'll need support. Not just medical, but emotional and practical. This kind of collapse doesn't happen overnight. It builds over time. After the doctor left, I sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of my fury. David Ashford, wherever he was, whatever he was doing, had abandoned my daughter when she needed him most. He'd let her deteriorate to the point of collapse while he disappeared on some mysterious business trip. But I was Amelia Barry. I'd built a multi-million-dollar consulting empire from nothing after my husband's death. I'd negotiated with Fortune 500 CEOs and come out ahead every time. I had resources, connections, and most importantly, the cold, calculating intelligence that had made me formidable in boardrooms across Manhattan. If David Ashford thought he could abandon my daughter and grandchild without consequences, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Richard Blackwood, the most ruthless attorney in New York, a man who had helped me navigate the treacherous waters of corporate law for over a decade. He answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. "Amelia, welcome back." "How was Europe, Richard? I need you to drop everything and meet me at Presbyterian Lawrence Hospital. Now what's wrong?" "My daughter is in intensive care and my son-in-law has vanished. I want everything, and I mean everything, about David Ashford's financial life examined by morning. Bank accounts, credit cards, business holdings, personal assets, all of it." A pause. Richard had worked with me long enough to recognize the tone in my voice, the same one I'd used when hostile takeover attempts threatened my company. Considered done. "Amelia, are you all right?" I looked at my daughter's unconscious form at the monitors tracking my grandchild's heartbeat at the evidence of a man's callous abandonment. "I will be," I said quietly. "Once David Ashford learns what it means to cross the Berry family." As I hung up the phone, Isabella stirred slightly in her sleep. For just a moment her eyes fluttered open and focused on my face. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe now. The baby's strong and healthy, just like her mother." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "David, he left." I smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Don't worry about David. Mom is going to take care of everything." She drifted back to sleep, but her words echoed in my mind. "He left. He left. He left." David Ashford had made the biggest mistake of his life when he abandoned my daughter. But he was about to discover that some mistakes come with a price tag that even his arrogance couldn't afford. I settled back into the hospital chair, my mind already working through the possibilities, the connections, the careful moves that would ensure justice. Outside dawn was still hours away, but I could already see the beginning of the end for David Ashford. Some storms announce themselves with thunder and lightning. Others gather quietly and visibly until they strike with devastating precision. David was about to experience the latter. Before we continue with what happened next, I want to pause and speak to every mother, grandmother, and woman listening who has ever felt that protective fire when someone threatened their family. If you've ever been told you're too old to start over, let me tell you that's a lie. Your story isn't over, and you still have chapters left to write. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with simple, powerful steps to help you heal, rebuild, and fall in love with life again. Click the link in the description box and start your new beginning today. And remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because every woman deserves to hear stories that remind her of her own power. Now let's continue with what I discovered about David's business trip. Richard Blackwood arrived at the hospital at 7:00 a.m., sharp, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the grim expression that had made him one of Manhattan's most feared attorneys. He found me in the family waiting room where I'd spent the night reading financial documents on my tablet while Isabella slept. "Talk to me," he said, settling into the chair across from mine. I accepted the coffee gratefully. European espresso was wonderful, but sometimes you needed American caffeine to fuel American problems. Isabella collapsed 3 days ago from what the doctors are calling stress-induced complications. She's 8 months pregnant. Richard, 8 months. And her husband disappeared over a week ago on what he claimed was a business trip. Richard's jaw tightened. In the 15 years I'd known him, he'd handle my divorce from my first husband, my business acquisitions, and my estate planning. He'd seen me angry before, but never like this. "What did your overnight research uncover?" he asked. I pulled up the files I'd been studying. David's tech startup filed for bankruptcy protection 6 months ago. He never told Isabella. The house they're living in. Second mortgage taken out 8 weeks ago. Her savings account cleaned out gradually over the past 4 months. It gets worse. I swiped to the next screen. Credit cards maxed out in both their names. And here's the interesting part. His last known location according to his credit card activity. I turned the tablet toward Richard. His eyebrows rose as he read the charges. Hawaiian resort, yacht rentals, expensive restaurants, jewelry stores. He's been living it up in Maui while his pregnant wife was literally dying, Richard said quietly. That's not even the best part. I pulled up the final piece of evidence, a screenshot I'd found on social media at 4 a.m. after hours of careful searching. Look at this. It was an Instagram story from someone named @Tiffany Lux Life. A blonde woman in her mid-20s posing on the deck of a luxury yacht, champagne glass raised to the sunset. She was stunning in that artificial, heavily filtered way that social media had made popular. But it wasn't her appearance that made Richard curse under his breath. It was the man in the background of the photo, his arm clearly visible wrapped around her waist. The distinctive Rolex watch Isabella had given David for their anniversary. The same watch he'd been wearing in every family photo for the past 2 years. Who is she? Richard asked. Tiffany Martinez, age 25. Instagram influencer specializing in luxury lifestyle content. According to her posts, she's been in Hawaii for 2 weeks, documenting her romantic getaway with her amazing boyfriend who's been spoiling her rotten. I scrolled through more photos. David and Tiffany at expensive restaurants on helicopter tours, shopping for jewelry that cost more than most people's cars, all while Isabella lay alone in our house growing weaker by the day. The son of a Richard muttered, "Language, Richard." But I felt the same rage burning in my chest. "Now, tell me what you found." Richard opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "David Ashford's financial picture is even worse than you suspected. The tech company isn't just bankrupt. He's facing potential fraud charges from investors who claim he misrepresented the business's viability. How much debt? Personal debt. Close to $2 million. Business debt, another $4 million. He's been shuffling money between accounts for months, probably trying to stay ahead of creditors. I absorbed this information with a cold calculation that had served me well in business. David wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a desperate man with everything to lose and no moral boundaries to stop him from dragging my daughter down with him. What's his access to Isabella's money? That's where it gets complicated. She has a substantial trust fund from your husband's estate, but most of it is locked until she turns 35 or has a child. However, she does have a personal checking account with about $400,000 and a credit line secured against her trust. And David has access, her husband. Yes. Joint accounts, shared credit cards, the works. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. David had been systematically draining Isabella's accessible funds to finance his affair and his failing business, while she grew weaker and more isolated. He'd probably convinced her that their financial problems were temporary, that he was working on solutions, that she shouldn't worry her pregnant mind about money. Meanwhile, he was buying jewelry for his mistress with money intended for their child's future. "Richard, I want every account frozen today. Amelia, I don't care if it's complicated. I don't care if it requires emergency court orders. My daughter is lying in an ICU bed, and that bastard is spending her money on champagne. And Richard had worked with me long enough to know when I'd crossed from angry to implacable. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. While he worked his legal magic, I returned to Isabella's bedside. She was awake, staring out the window at the grey October morning. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Tired, confused. The nurses keep asking about David, and I don't know what to tell them. I sat down and took her hand. "Tell me what happened from the beginning." Isabella's story emerged slowly, punctuated by tears and long pauses. David had been distant for months, claiming work stress. He'd been taking calls at odd hours, disappearing for client meetings that lasted all day. Their joint credit card bills had grown enormous. But when Isabella questioned the charges, David became defensive and angry. "He said I was being paranoid," she whispered. "That pregnancy hormones were making me suspicious of normal business expenses." He showed me some contracts and proposals, said everything would be fine once the big deal closed. What big deal? Some tech company in California wanted to buy his software platform. He said it was worth millions, that we'd never have to worry about money again. I felt my heart break for my daughter's naivety. There was no big deal. There never had been. David had been feeding her lies while systematically destroying their financial future. When did he leave for Hawaii? Isabella's face crumbled. He said it was a business meeting. Potential investors who wanted to meet in person. He'd be gone a week, maybe 2 at the most. She looked at me with the same trusting eyes she'd had as a child. "Mom, it's been 10 days. I've called and called, but his phone goes straight to voicemail. I was so worried something had happened to him." "Nothing happened to him, sweetheart, except that he revealed exactly who he really is." I showed her the photos from Instagram. I watched my strong, independent daughter collapse as she saw the truth. Her husband, the father of her unborn child, laughing and celebrating with another woman while she fought for survival. "How could he do this?" she sobbed. "How could he leave me like this? Because he's not the man you thought you married," I said gently. "But that's his failure, not yours, and now we're going to make sure he faces the consequences." My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "It's done. All accounts frozen as of 30 minutes ago. His credit cards will start declining within the hour." I smiled grimly and typed back. "Excellent. Now the real fun begins." Isabella fell asleep again, exhausted by the emotional revelation. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "Sleep, sweetheart. Mama's going to take care of everything." In the hallway outside the ICU, I called Margaret, my assistant. "I need you to contact Patricia Williams at Social Scene magazine. Tell her I have an exclusive story about tech fraud and adultery that might interest her readers. Full documentation, photographs, financial records, the works. Should I mention it involves your family?" "Absolutely. The Barry family doesn't run from scandal. We control it." As I hung up, I felt the familiar surge of energy that came with orchestrating a complex business strategy. David Ashford had made a critical error in judgment. He'd underestimated me, dismissed me as just another mother-in-law to be managed and ignored. He was about to discover that some mothers don't just get mad, we get even. At 2:47 p.m. Hawaii time, David Ashford's perfect paradise began to crumble. I know the exact time because Richard had arranged for real-time monitoring of David's account activity. As I sat beside Isabella's hospital bed, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in days, my phone buzzed with updates from our financial surveillance operation. 2:47 p.m. Credit card declined. Kona Village Resort Spa Services, $850. 2:52 p.m. Credit card declined. Maui Ocean Center Marine Adventures, $1,200, 2:55 p.m. Credit card declined. Helicopter tour booking $2,500. I imagine the scene playing out 6,000 plumbers away. David fumbling for a different card. The embarrassment spreading across his face as each one was declined in turn. Tiffany watching with growing confusion and irritation as her sugar daddy suddenly couldn't afford to maintain their lavish lifestyle. My phone rang at exactly 3:15 p.m., unknown number with it 808 area code. I let it ring 4 times before answering, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. Amelia Barry. "What the hell did you do?" David's voice was raw with panic and rage. In the background, I could hear tropical music and the chatter of other tourists. He was probably calling from the resort lobby after being humiliated at the front desk. "I'm sorry. Could you be more specific?" "I've done quite a few things today." "My cards, Amelia. Every single one of them. Declined. Frozen. I can't even pay for gas to get back to the hotel. How terrible for you." I kept my voice ice cold. Professional. I imagine it's quite embarrassing to be stranded without funds, especially when you're not alone. A pause in that silence. I could practically hear his mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew. "I don't know what you think you know, but I know you abandoned my daughter while she was carrying your child. I know she's been lying unconscious in intensive care for 3 days while you've been drinking champagne on yacht decks. I know you've stolen nearly $400,000 from her accounts to fund your midlife crisis vacation with a woman half your age." The silence stretched longer this time. When David spoke again, his voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You have no right to interfere in our marriage. I have every right to protect my daughter and grandchild from a man who would leave them to die while he plays house with an Instagram. Isabella is fine. She's just being dramatic. Isabella is in the ICU. David machines are keeping track of her heartbeat and our grandchild's vital signs. The doctors said if she hadn't been found when she was both she and the baby would have died." Another pause. This one carried a different quality, not just shock, but the terrible weight of realization. For the first time in our conversation, David sounded uncertain. "That's not... She can't be. I talked to her just last week. You talked to her last week. Then you disappeared to Hawaii with your mistress while she collapsed from dehydration and stress-induced complications. The neighbors found her unconscious in the front yard. David, your pregnant wife was dying alone while you were posting out photos on social media." I heard him suck in a sharp breath. "I need to come home. I need to book a flight right now. With what money I've frozen every account connected to Isabella's finances. Your credit cards, your bank accounts, even your business credit lines. You wanted to play games with my daughter's life. Now you get to play them without her money. You can't do this. It's illegal. Actually, it's completely legal. Isabella is incapacitated due to a medical emergency which gives me power of attorney over her financial affairs as her next of kin. Richard Blackwood filed the emergency paperwork this morning. Every judge in New York knows my name, David, and they all know my reputation for protecting what matters to me." The panic in his voice was growing more acute. "Amelia, please. I made mistakes, but I can fix this. I love Isabella. I want to be there for her. You love Isabella's money. You love the lifestyle her trust fund provided. You love having a wife at home while you play with younger women on her dime. But you don't love Isabella herself, because if you did, you never could have left her alone and vulnerable while your way through Hawaii. I had never spoken to him so bluntly before. In 3 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings, I had maintained the polite facade that wealthy families perfect over generations. But now the gloves were off, and David was hearing the voice that had negotiated billion-dollar deals and destroyed corporate rivals. "I'm flying home tonight," he said desperately. "I'll figure out the money somehow. I'll make this right." "No, you won't, because you don't understand what you're really dealing with." "What do you mean?" I looked at Isabella sleeping peacefully, her hand resting protectively over her belly. My grandchild was fighting for life inside a mother who had been abandoned at her most vulnerable moment. The fury I felt was clean and cold and absolutely implacable. "I mean that you've committed the unforgivable sin, David. You hurt my family. And when someone hurts my family, I don't just get angry. I get systematic, Amelia. The account freeze is just the beginning. By tomorrow morning, everyone in our social circle will know exactly what kind of man you are. Your business partners will know about the fraud accusations and the bankruptcy. Your clients will know about the affairs and the abandoned pregnant wife. Your family will know that you stole from my daughter to pay for your Hawaiian vacation." "You wouldn't." But his voice suggested he was beginning to understand that I absolutely would. "I've already started. Patricia Williams from Social Scene is running the story in tomorrow's edition. Full spread, complete with photographs of you and Miss Martinez, courtesy of her very public Instagram account. The headline reads, 'Tech Mogul Abandons Dying Pregnant Wife for Hawaiian Love Nest.' The sound David made was somewhere between a growl and a whimper. "But that's not even the best part," I continued. "Richard is filing papers tomorrow to have you declared legally incompetent to manage family finances due to your demonstrated pattern of fraud and abandonment. We're seeking full control of any assets connected to Isabella or the baby retroactively." "That's impossible, is it?" "You've been systematically draining her accounts while she was medically vulnerable. You disappeared without contact information during a medical emergency. You've been documented engaging in adultery while using her money to finance the affair. I think any reasonable judge would conclude that you pose a clear and present danger to my daughter's financial well-being." I could hear Tiffany's voice in the background, shrill and demanding. "David, what's taking so long?" "The helicopter is leaving in 10 minutes. "Your girlfriend sounds impatient," I observed. "I hope she's understanding when you explain that the party's over." "Amelia, please. I know I screwed up, but you can't destroy my entire life over this. I'm not destroying your life, David. You did that yourself the moment you decided my daughter's suffering was less important than your pleasure. I'm simply making sure that everyone knows exactly who you really are. I'll sue you. I'll take this to court and prove you're acting out of spite." I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. "You'll sue me? With what money? What lawyer? What reputation? By tomorrow you'll be lucky if you can afford a bus ticket home from Hawaii, assuming you can even find someone willing to give you a loan." The line went quiet except for the sound of David's ragged breathing. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to figure out how to get yourself home to face the consequences of your actions. You're going to grovel for forgiveness that will never come. And you're going to learn what it means to cross a woman who built an empire from nothing and has absolutely no qualms about protecting what she loves. And if I don't, then you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what hit you. Because this is just day one, David. I have resources you can't imagine, connections you've never dreamed of, and a level of patient vindictiveness that would terrify you if you were smart enough to comprehend it." I hung up before he could respond, then immediately blocked his number. If David wanted to continue this conversation, he could do it through lawyers, assuming he could find one willing to work pro bono. Isabella stirred in her sleep, her hand moving protectively to her belly. In that gesture, I saw everything I was fighting for. Not just my daughter's future, but my grandchild's legacy. The baby growing inside her would never know want or fear because her grandmother had made sure of it. David Ashford had made the mistake of thinking that because I was polite, I was powerless. Because I was elegant, I was weak. Because I was a widow, I was vulnerable. He was about to spend the rest of his life learning how wrong he had been. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Emergency restraining order filed and approved. David cannot access any property or accounts connected to Isabella. He also cannot contact her directly without legal supervision. I smiled and typed back. Perfect. Now let's make sure he learns what burned bridges really means. The war had begun, and David had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. The next morning brought both hope and heartbreak in equal measure. Isabella was finally awake and alert when I arrived at the hospital with fresh flowers and the kind of homemade chicken soup that had comforted her through childhood illnesses. She looked fragile, propped up against the pillows, but there was color in her cheeks for the first time in days. "The baby?" she asked before I'd even set down my purse. "Strong heartbeat, normal movement. Dr. Martinez says she's a fighter just like her mother." Isabella's hand moved instinctively to her belly, and I saw tears of relief gather in her eyes. "I was so scared, Mom. For days before I collapsed, I could barely feel her moving. I thought I might be losing her." "You're not losing anything," I said, firmly settling into the chair beside her bed. "Both of you are going to be fine." But as Isabella told me more about the weeks leading up to her collapse, my fury toward David intensified beyond anything I'd felt the night before. "He said I was being paranoid about the baby," she whispered. "When I told him I was worried about how little she was moving," he said. "Pregnant women always overreact. When I wanted to call the doctor about the spotting, he said we couldn't afford unnecessary medical bills." "You were having spotting." I tried to keep the alarm out of my voice for about 2 weeks. Light, bleeding, cramping. I was terrified something was wrong, but David kept saying it was normal that his sister had bleeding during her pregnancy, and everything was fine. David didn't have a sister. I knew his family history as well as my own. He was an only child whose parents had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. He'd been lying to my daughter about everything, even her medical concerns. "Did you call Dr. Chin anyway?" Isabella shook her head, looking ashamed. "David took my phone and hid it. Said I was becoming obsessed with calling doctors and it wasn't healthy for the baby. He said stress was worse than any physical symptoms, and that I needed to trust him to take care of us." The manipulation was breathtakingly cruel. David had isolated Isabella from medical care during the most vulnerable period of her pregnancy, convincing her that her legitimate concerns were signs of mental instability. He'd gaslit her into believing that seeking help was somehow dangerous, while he prepared to abandon her entirely. "Isabella, sweetheart, I need you to understand something. Nothing that happened to you was your fault. David deliberately prevented you from getting the care you needed. He put both you and the baby at risk because it was convenient for his plans. His plans I had prepared for this conversation, but seeing the hope still flickering in my daughter's eyes made it infinitely harder. She still loved him. Despite everything, part of her was still hoping this was all a terrible misunderstanding that could somehow be resolved. I showed her the printed photos from Tiffany's Instagram account. Each image was a fresh flow. David laughing on the yacht deck. David feeding Tiffany expensive sushi. David's hands on her body as they watched the sunset. "This is where your husband has been while you've been fighting for your life," I said gently. "This is what he chose over you and his child." Isabella stared at the photos for a long time, her expression cycling through disbelief, hurt, and finally a cold rage that reminded me powerfully of myself. "How long?" she asked. "Based on the posts, at least 2 weeks, possibly longer." 2 weeks. Her voice was flat, emotionless. I was bleeding and scared and calling him crying. And he was with her. Yes. While I was lying here unconscious thinking he might be dead in a car accident somewhere, worried that he'd never meet his daughter, he was buying jewelry for his mistress with your money. Something shifted in Isabella's face then, a hardness I'd never seen before, but one I recognized from my own mirror during the worst moments of my business career. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Right now, I need you to focus on getting better. Let me handle David." "No." Isabella struggled to sit up straighter. "He's my husband. This is my marriage. My money he stole. My child he abandoned. I want to be part of whatever you're planning." I studied my daughter's face, seeing the steel beneath the vulnerability. Perhaps it was time for Isabella to learn that she came from a long line of women who didn't accept betrayal gracefully. "All right, but you need to understand what I'm planning isn't just divorce proceedings and asset division. I'm going to destroy him completely financially, socially, professionally. When I'm finished, David Ashford will serve as a cautionary tale for other men who think they can abuse women without consequences." Isabella nodded slowly. "Good. He deserves it. Even if it means our family name will be connected to scandal. Even if people will gossip and speculate, let them gossip. I'm not ashamed of being victimized by a man I trusted. I'm ashamed of staying quiet while he does it to someone else." Dr. Martinez chose that moment to enter with Isabella's latest test results, her smile brightening when she saw how alert and determined my daughter looked. "This is much better," she said, checking the monitors. "Your blood pressure is stabilizing, and the baby's movements are back to normal patterns. I'd say we avoided the worst-case scenario." "When can I go home?" Isabella asked. "If everything continues improving, maybe in another week. But you'll need complete bed rest for the remainder of your pregnancy, and someone should be with you around the clock. She'll be staying with me," I said immediately. "My penthouse has a full medical suite, and I can arrange for private nursing care." Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "That sounds ideal. The stress factors that contributed to this crisis need to be completely eliminated." After the doctor left, Isabella looked at me with eyes that held both gratitude and something harder to define, a new understanding of who her mother really was. "You've already thought of everything, haven't you?" she said. "The medical care, the security, the legal strategy. You've been planning this like a military campaign. When someone threatens my family, I don't leave anything to chance." "What about David? Where is he now?" I checked my phone where Margaret had been sending me regular updates on David's situation. According to our latest information, he's stranded at the Kona Village Resort. Security cameras show him arguing with the front desk staff this morning. He managed to book a room for one more night by convincing the manager to let him use his business credit card, but that account will be frozen by tomorrow morning. And Tiffany. She posted a story 2 hours ago from the airport captioned, "When the vacation turns into a nightmare. Apparently, your husband didn't mention his financial problems until the bills started getting declined." She's flying back to Los Angeles and has already deleted most of the photos of them together. Isabella almost smiled, so she abandoned him the second the money dried up. Some people reveal their true nature under pressure. David is learning that lesson from multiple angles right now. My phone buzzed with a call from Richard. I answered on speaker so Isabella could hear. "Ladies, I have updates. The restraining order is in effect. David cannot come within 500 feet of Isabella or attempt to contact her directly. His passport has been flagged to alert us when he attempts to return to the mainland." "What about the financial situation?" Isabella asked. "Complete asset freeze is holding. But there's more. I've been digging into his business dealings, and the fraud accusations are worse than we initially thought. He's been running a Ponzi scheme disguised as a tech startup, using new investor money to pay earlier investors while skimming funds for personal use." Isabella and I exchanged glances. This explained the expensive lifestyle David had been maintaining, despite his claimed business struggles. "How much money?" I asked. "Conservative estimate. He's defrauded investors out of nearly $8 million over the past 2 years. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is already investigating. They just haven't made it public yet." "So David isn't just an unfaithful husband," Isabella said slowly. "He's a federal criminal." "It gets better," Richard continued. 3 of his investors have already filed civil suits. When they discover his personal assets have been frozen due to abandonment and fraud allegations, they'll petition the court for immediate seizure of anything he owns. I felt a warm glow of satisfaction. David's house of cards was collapsing faster than I dared to hope. "There's one more thing," Richard said. "I got a call from David's business partner, Marcus Webb. He wants to meet with us tomorrow. Says he has information about David's activities that might interest us. What kind of information he wouldn't say over the phone, but he sounded scared. I think David's business partners are realizing they need to distance themselves from him before the federal investigation becomes public." After Richard hung up, Isabella and I sat in contemplative silence. The magnitude of David's betrayal was becoming clear. He hadn't just abandoned his pregnant wife. He'd been systematically stealing from investors while using my daughter's money to maintain the facade of success. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you," Isabella said quietly. "About the money he took from my accounts." "What about it?" I know I should have noticed sooner, but he was so good at explaining everything away. He said the large withdrawals were for business investments that would pay dividends after the baby was born. He showed me fake contracts, projected earnings reports, even pictures of office spaces he claimed to be renting. "How much did he take?" Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. "Everything I had access to. Nearly $600,000 over the past 6 months. The number hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't just been skimming money for personal expenses. He'd been systematically draining Isabella's accessible funds to prop up his failing criminal enterprise. "Isabella, that money was meant to secure your future and the baby's. It was supposed to buy your house fund the nursery provide for maternity leave." I know. I trusted him completely. Even when things started feeling wrong, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid because of pregnancy hormones. The pain in her voice was heartbreaking, but I could also hear something else, a growing steel that told me my daughter was done being a victim. "We're going to get it back," I said firmly. "Every penny plus damages plus interest plus compensation for the emotional trauma he's caused." "How?" "Because David made one crucial mistake. He assumed that because I've been quiet and polite during family gatherings, I'm weak. He confused courtesy with powerlessness. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my contacts. Judges, prosecutors, FBI agents I'd worked with during various corporate investigations over the years. Your father left you more than just money, Isabella. He left you a network of connections that stretches from Wall Street to Washington. And every single one of those people owes me favors that I've been saving for exactly this kind of situation. Isabella watched me work with fascination and growing understanding. You're not just going after David. Legally, are you? You're going to make sure everyone knows what he did. By the time I'm finished, David Ashford will be unemployable, unbankable, and unmarriageable. His name will be synonymous with fraud and betrayal, and every woman he tries to charm in the future will Google his name and discover exactly what kind of man he really is. What about me? What about the baby? I took my daughter's hand in mine, feeling the strength that was beginning to return to her grip. You're going to heal. You're going to give birth to a healthy, beautiful daughter, and you're going to raise her with the knowledge that her mother and grandmother never backed down from a fight when family was threatened. And David, I smiled, and it was the same expression that had made Fortune 500 CEOs nervous across conference tables for 20 years. David is going to learn why the Barry women have a reputation for being gracious in victory and absolutely ruthless in war. Isabella squeezed my hand. When do we start? Sweetheart, we started the moment he decided your suffering was acceptable collateral damage for his pleasure. That night, as Isabella slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, I sat beside her bed and made a series of phone calls that would ensure David Ashford's return to New York would be very different from the triumphant homecoming he might have been imagining. Some mistakes can be forgiven. Some betrayals can be overcome. But abandoning a pregnant woman to die while stealing her money to finance an affair, that was the kind of error that destroyed lives permanently. And I was just getting started. Marcus Webb turned out to be exactly the kind of man I'd expected David to partner with. Nervous, ambitious, and entirely willing to sacrifice loyalty for self-preservation. He arrived at Richard's office the next morning wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide the sweat stains under his arms or the tremor in his hands as he shook mine. Mrs. Barry, I want you to know that I had no idea about David's personal situation. He began before we'd even sat down. If I'd known he was stealing from family accounts to fund business operations, you would have done. What exactly? I settled into the leather chair across from Richard's massive mahogany desk, my pearl necklace catching the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Marcus swallowed hard. I would have ended our partnership immediately, but you didn't end it when you discovered he was defrauding investors. The question hung in the air like a blade. Marcus's face went pale, confirming what I'd suspected. David's business partners had known about the Ponzi scheme and chosen to look the other way as long as they were profiting. That is the investor situation is complicated. No, Mr. Webb, it's quite simple. David has been operating a fraudulent investment scheme and you've been complicit. The only question now is whether you're going to help us recover the money he stole from my daughter, or whether you're going to go down with him when the FBI finalizes their investigation. Richard slid a folder across the desk. We know about the fake contracts, the manufactured financial reports the shell companies use to funnel investor money into personal accounts. We also know about your commission structure and how much you've personally profited from the scheme. Marcus opened the folder with shaking hands, his face growing ashen as he read through the financial records we'd compiled overnight. This is how did you get this information? I have resources you can't imagine, I said calmly. The question is what you're willing to do to avoid becoming a federal defendant alongside David. For the next hour, Marcus Webb sang like a canary desperate to avoid a cage. The tech startup had been hemorrhaging money for over a year, but David had been covering the losses by soliciting new investors with fabricated success stories and fake revenue projections. When legitimate funding dried up, he'd started using personal money. First his own savings, then joint accounts with Isabella, then direct theft from her trust-accessible funds. He told me his wife was supporting the business temporarily. Marcus said, sweat beating on his forehead. He said she believed in the vision and wanted to invest in their future. Did you ever meet my daughter? A few times at company parties she seemed, I don't know, tired, distracted. David said pregnancy was making her emotional and irrational. Another layer of manipulation. David had been poisoning his business partner's perception of Isabella to prevent anyone from questioning why she seemed increasingly withdrawn and stressed. What about the Hawaii trip? Richard asked. Marcus looked sick. David said it was an investor meeting. There's a venture capital firm based in Honolulu that had expressed interest in our platform. He was supposed to be presenting our latest projections and negotiating terms. There was no investigating, I said quietly. I know that now. When I couldn't reach him for 3 days, I called the VC firm myself. They'd never heard of David or our company. What did you think was happening? I thought God. I thought maybe he'd run off with investor money. I started preparing to distance the company from him, maybe claim I'd been deceived too. Marcus looked at me with desperate eyes. I never imagined he'd abandoned his pregnant wife. I swear to you if I'd known. I studied Marcus Webb for a long moment, seeing not malice but weakness. The kind of moral cowardice that enabled men like David to cause massive damage while others looked the other way. Here's what's going to happen. I said, finally, you're going to provide us with complete financial records of David's activities, bank statements, investor communications, business contracts, everything. You're going to cooperate fully with the FBI investigation, and you're going to help us recover every penny he stole from my daughter. And in exchange, Richard will ensure that your cooperation is noted when federal charges are filed. Instead of being prosecuted as David's co-conspirator, you'll be treated as a witness who helped expose the fraud. Marcus nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. Whatever you need. I also want David's passport information, his emergency contacts, and details about any other personal assets he might have hidden. He has a safety deposit box at First National. Marcus offered immediately, and a storage unit in Queens where he keeps business equipment. Oh, and his aunt in Portland has been receiving packages for him over the past few months. Expensive electronics, jewelry, things like that. I exchanged glances with Richard. David had been preparing for his eventual disappearance, squirreling away valuable items that he could liquidate if his scheme collapsed. Get me addresses, account numbers, and access information for all of it, Richard instructed. After Marcus left carrying Richard's business card and a cooperation agreement that would hopefully keep him out of federal prison, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. David's support network was crumbling exactly as I'd planned. What's our next move? Richard asked. I want emergency court orders to seize anything David owns or controls. The safety deposit box, the storage unit, even the packages sent to his aunt. If he's hidden assets, I want them recovered and applied to what he owes Isabella and David himself. I checked my phone where Margaret had been providing hourly updates on David's situation in Hawaii. According to our latest intelligence, he's managed to borrow enough money for a one-way ticket to Los Angeles. His flight lands tomorrow morning at LAX. Do we want him arrested at the airport? Not yet. I want him to make it back to New York. I want him to see what's left of his life before we finish destroying it. Richard raised an eyebrow. That's unusually patient of you. I've learned that revenge is most effective when the victim has time to understand the scope of their destruction. David needs to see his empty apartment, his frozen accounts, his ruined reputation. He needs to comprehend exactly how thoroughly he's lost before we deliver the final blow. That afternoon I returned to the hospital to find Isabella sitting up in bed, looking stronger than she had since I'd found her in the ICU. Dr. Martinez had cleared her to receive visitors, and she was eager to hear about the morning's developments. "So, Marcus is cooperating?" she asked after I'd filled her in on the meeting completely. Apparently the prospect of federal prison is wonderfully motivating, and David's assets will have access to everything by tomorrow. Richard estimates we can recover at least half of what he stole, possibly more, depending on what's in the safety deposit box. Isabella nodded, but I could see something else weighing on her mind. "What is it, sweetheart, I keep thinking about Tiffany, the girl from Hawaii? What about her? She's probably a victim too, in her own way. David is older, sophisticated, wealthy, or at least he appeared to be. She might not have known he was married or that he was stealing money to pay for their relationship." I felt a surge of pride at my daughter's capacity for empathy, even toward the woman who'd been sleeping with her husband. "You're probably right. Men like David are expert manipulators. They tell different lies to different people until no one knows the truth. Do you think she'll come forward when the FBI investigation becomes public? I think she'll do whatever protects her own interests, which probably means cooperating with prosecutors if they ask." Isabella was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on her belly where our granddaughter was growing stronger every day. "Mom, there's something I want to do when this is all over. What's that? I want to help other women recognize the warning signs of financial abuse. I was educated, successful, surrounded by people who loved me, and I still fell for David's manipulation. How many other women are trapped in similar situations without the resources to fight back?" I studied my daughter's face, seeing the beginning of something that looked like purpose emerging from pain. "What did you have in mind? Maybe a foundation or a support network, something that helps women understand their financial rights and provides legal assistance when they're being exploited by partners." "That's a beautiful idea, Isabella, and it would be a powerful way to ensure that David's cruelty serves a larger purpose. I want our granddaughter to grow up in a world where women don't have to depend on anyone else's permission to protect themselves." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "She will, because she'll have a mother who learned not to trust blindly, and a grandmother who taught her that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all." My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "David's flight confirmed for tomorrow morning. Should I arrange reception committee?" I smiled and typed back, "Not yet. Let him enjoy his last day of freedom. The reckoning comes when he's ready to appreciate it fully." Isabella saw my expression and raised an eyebrow. "What are you planning now? I'm planning to give David exactly what he deserves. A front row seat to the complete destruction of everything he thought he was entitled to. And then we focus on the future. Your recovery, the baby's birth, and making sure that what happened to us never happens to another family." As I left the hospital that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Richard's death. A sense of purpose that went beyond protecting what I loved to actively creating a better world. David Ashford had meant to destroy my daughter and steal our family's future. Instead, he'd awakened something in both of us that would make us stronger, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to men who preyed on women's trust. The legal war was just beginning, but the outcome was already decided. David simply didn't know it yet. Patricia Williams had outdone herself. The Social Scene magazine spread was devastating in its thoroughness. 6 full pages of David's public humiliation, complete with timeline graphics, financial charts, and the kind of high-resolution photography that made every detail of his betrayal impossible to ignore. The headline read, "Tech Mogul's Hawaiian Nightmare: How David Ashford Abandoned His Dying Pregnant Wife for an Instagram Influencer." I read it over breakfast in my penthouse, savoring each perfectly crafted paragraph while watching the sunrise paint Manhattan in shades of gold and pink. Patricia had positioned the story as a cautionary tale about modern masculinity and the danger of prioritizing wealth and image over family values. The writing was elegant, factual, and completely damning, but the photographs were what made it truly devastating. There was David on the yacht deck, champagne glass raised in celebration, while a sidebar showed Isabella's hospital bracelet dated the same day. David and Tiffany at an expensive restaurant feeding each other sushi, while another sidebar displayed the medical bills from Isabella's emergency treatment. David's Rolex-adorned wrist wrapped around Tiffany's waist with a small insert showing the credit card statements that proved he'd used Isabella's money to buy the jewelry. The visual storytelling was brutal and impossible to deny. My phone had been ringing since 6 a.m., with calls from friends, business associates, and reporters who'd seen the story. I let most of them go to voicemail, but when Victoria Ashford called one of my oldest friends and a social arbiter whose opinion carried weight in our circles, I answered immediately. "Amelia, darling, I just saw the magazine. I'm absolutely horrified. How is Isabella?" "She's healing. Thank you. Both she and the baby are going to be fine. And that dreadful man, I cannot believe anyone could be so callous. David is learning that actions have consequences." "Good. You know I never liked him. There was always something calculating about him. Too charming, too quick with compliments. Men like that are usually hiding something. This was exactly the kind of social validation I'd been counting on. David had fooled Isabella and even some of our family friends. But the kind of women who moved in our circles had decades of experience identifying predators who targeted wealthy families. I wish Isabella had felt comfortable sharing her concerns earlier. I said carefully, "Oh, darling, you know how these manipulative men work. They isolate their victims, make them feel crazy for questioning anything." My cousin went through something similar with her second husband. By the time she realized what was happening, he'd already hidden half their assets in offshore accounts. After Victoria hung up, Margaret called to update me on the story's impact. "It's trending on social media," she reported. "Tiffany Martinez has locked down all her accounts after getting flooded with angry comments. David's business website crashed from traffic." Apparently, people are posting screenshots of the magazine article in the comment sections. What about David himself? His flight landed 2 hours ago. He took an Uber to his apartment, then called Richard's office, screaming about defamation and invasion of privacy. And Richard's response, he reminded David that everything in the article is documented, fact-based on public records and social media posts. Hard to claim defamation when you posted the evidence yourself. I smiled, imagining David's rage as he discovered that his carefully curated social media presence had become evidence of his character. The photos he'd allowed Tiffany to post as trophies of their luxury vacation were now exhibits in the case against him. Any word from his former business associates? 3 more investor meetings canceled today. Marcus Webb issued a statement distancing the company from David's personal difficulties, and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit called they want to schedule a formal interview about David's business practices. Everything was proceeding exactly as I'd orchestrated. David's professional reputation was crumbling as quickly as his personal life, and the federal investigation was gaining momentum. But the most satisfying development came at noon, when Richard called with news that made me laugh out loud. David just fired his divorce attorney, he announced. Why? Apparently the lawyer read the magazine article and realized that David has no assets to pay legal fees with. He withdrew from the case, citing irreconcilable differences regarding client expectations and financial reality. So David is representing himself for now, though I suspect that won't last long once he realizes how complex Isabella's financial situation actually is. What do you mean I've been reviewing your husband's estate planning documents? The trust structure he created is significantly more sophisticated than David understands. Isabella's inheritance isn't just about money. It includes voting rights in several companies' property holdings and intellectual property rights that David never even knew existed. This was news to me as well. Richard had been managing the more complex aspects of Richard's estate while I focused on day-to-day business operations. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimate, Isabella's total inheritance when she turns 35 will be worth approximately $50 million. The trust David thought he was accessing represents less than 2% of her actual net worth. I felt a moment of pure crystalline satisfaction. David had destroyed his marriage and committed federal crimes for access to what amounted to pocket change compared to Isabella's real inheritance. Does Isabella know I thought you should tell her yourself? And there's more. The trust includes provisions for children. Your granddaughter will have access to education funds, property holdings, and eventually her own substantial inheritance. Meaning, David walked away from generational wealth to chase a 25-year-old influencer with fake breasts and a gambling problem. It appears so. Though I should mention we've received 3 phone calls today from David demanding to speak with Isabella directly. He's violating the restraining order. Not technically, since he's calling the lawyer's office rather than contacting her directly, but he's increasingly desperate. I could imagine David was beginning to understand the scope of what he'd lost, not just in emotional terms, but in cold financial reality. He traded a life of genuine luxury and security for a brief affair that had already ended in abandonment and public humiliation. What does he want? Reconciliation? Forgiveness, a chance to explain himself. He keeps insisting that the magazine article is biased and that people don't understand the full situation. The full situation being that he abandoned his pregnant wife to go a stripper in Hawaii. I don't think he'd phrase it quite that way. That afternoon, I visited Isabella at the hospital to share the news about her inheritance and David's deteriorating situation. I found her reading pregnancy books and taking notes in a journal planning for the future with a kind of practical optimism that reminded me powerfully of her father. "How are you feeling today?" I asked. "Stronger, angry, but in a productive way, doctor. Martinez says my blood pressure is back to normal and the baby's movement patterns are excellent." "Good. I have some updates that might interest you." I told her about the magazine article's impact, David's professional collapse, and most importantly, the true scope of her inheritance. Isabella listened with growing amazement as Richard's estate planning unfolded. $50 million, she whispered. "At minimum, your father was very sophisticated about wealth preservation and growth strategies. What David stole represents less than 1% of what you'll eventually inherit. So he destroyed our marriage and committed crimes for essentially nothing from a financial perspective, though I suspect his motivations were more about control than money. Men like David need to feel powerful, and they often express that through financial manipulation." Isabella was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of David's miscalculation. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you about the day I collapsed. What is it?" I had called David that morning, crying, telling him I was scared about the bleeding and the baby's decreased movement. I begged him to come home, or at least help me figure out what to do. What did he say? He told me I was being hysterical, that pregnancy was making me irrational and needy. He said if I didn't stop calling him with imaginary emergencies, he was going to have to stay away even longer to avoid my toxic stress. The cruelty of it took my breath away. David had been partying on a yacht while my daughter bled and begged for help, and his response had been to blame her for her own medical emergency. Then he hung up on me. Isabella continued. "I tried calling back, but he blocked my number. That's when I realized he wasn't coming home, that I was completely alone. 'You're never going to be alone again,' I said fiercely. 'I promise you that. I know.' But Mom, I want him to understand what he did. Not just the money or the affair, but the fact that he left his child's mother to die rather than interrupt his vacation." "What do you want to do?" Isabella looked at me with eyes that held steel beneath the tears. "I want to face him. I want him to look at me and see what his choices cost. And I want him to understand that he'll never, ever have any power over me or our daughter again. The restraining order can be modified to allow a supervised meeting if I request it. I've been thinking about this, Mom. I need to see him once more, but on my terms with my protection, so I can finally close this chapter." I studied my daughter's face, seeing the same determination that had driven me through decades of business challenges and personal crisis. "If that's what you want, we can arrange it. But Isabella, you need to understand, seeing him might be harder than you expect." "It might be. But I'm not the same woman who married him. I'm not the same person who trusted him blindly or made excuses for his behavior. I'm the mother of his child, and I'm a Barry woman who doesn't back down from difficult conversations." I smiled, feeling fierce pride in the woman my daughter was becoming. "Then let's give David exactly what he's been asking for. A chance to explain himself under controlled circumstances that favor us completely. Of course, I didn't raise you to fight fair when someone's been cheating." That evening, as I reviewed the final details of David's public destruction, I reflected on how completely he'd misunderstood what he was up against. He'd seen Isabella as an isolated, dependent wife, and me as an aging widow who could be dismissed and managed. Instead, he'd awakened a mother's protective fury and a daughter's righteous anger. The combination was proving more devastating than any revenge I could have planned alone. David wanted to explain himself. Perfect. Some explanations were best delivered in person with witnesses and with the full weight of consequences clearly visible. I looked forward to giving him that opportunity. The meeting took place in Richard's conference room on a grey Thursday morning in November. I had arranged every detail with military precision. Isabella in the chair closest to the door for easy exit. Myself positioned where I could see David's face clearly. Richard at the head of the table with legal documents spread before him like weapons. David arrived 10 minutes late, probably hoping to make some kind of power play through tardiness. But when he walked into that room, any illusion of control evaporated immediately. He looked terrible. The golden tan from Hawaii had faded to a sickly yellow. His expensive suit hung loose on a frame that had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and his eyes carried the haunted look of a man who'd been staring at his own destruction for weeks. But it was the way he looked at Isabella that told me everything I needed to know about who David Ashford really was. There was no shame in his expression as he saw my daughter pale, fragile, obviously still recovering from her medical crisis. No regret for the pain he'd caused, or the danger he'd put her and the baby in. Instead, I saw calculation, manipulation, the predatory assessment of a man trying to determine how to regain control over a situation that had slipped away from him. "Isabella," he said, his voice carrying false warmth that made my skin crawl. "Thank God you're all right. I've been so worried about you." My daughter studied him for a long moment before responding, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and cold. "Have you? Because your credit card records show you were buying jewelry for your girlfriend while I was unconscious in the ICU. David's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger beneath his practice charm. "That situation was complicated. You don't understand what really happened." "Then explain it," Isabella said simply. "Explain how leaving your pregnant wife alone for weeks while you vacation with another woman was somehow justifiable. I never meant for you to get sick. I thought you were just being dramatic about the symptoms. You know how you get when you're stressed." The gaslight attempt was so blatant, so perfectly typical of his psychological manipulation that I almost laughed. David was still trying to convince Isabella that her medical emergency had been a character flaw rather than a consequence of his abandonment. "Dramatic," Isabella repeated. "I was bleeding and in pain, David. Our daughter could have died." "But she didn't die, did she? You're both fine now. These things happen in pregnancies. It's not like it was my fault." Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Ashford, perhaps we should discuss the financial irregularities in your accounts before we address personal matters." David's attention snapped to the papers spread across the conference table, and for the first time since entering the room he looked genuinely afraid. "I don't know what you think you found, but we've found evidence of systematic financial fraud spanning 2 years, Richard said calmly. "Falsified investor reports, misappropriated funds, and direct theft from your wife's personal accounts to fund both business operations and personal expenses. That's not theft." Isabella agreed to support the business. When I asked, quietly, "When exactly did Isabella agree to let you steal $600,000 to pay for Hawaiian vacations and jewelry for your mistress?" David's face flushed red. "I wasn't stealing. I was borrowing against future earnings. The business was about to close a major deal." "There was no deal," Richard interrupted. "Your business partner has provided complete financial records. Your company was operating as a Ponzi scheme using new investor money to pay earlier investors while skimming funds for personal use. Marcus doesn't know what he's talking about. Marcus is cooperating with federal investigators, as are 3 of your former investors who filed criminal complaints." The color drained from David's face as he realized the scope of his legal jeopardy, but rather than showing remorse or taking responsibility, he did exactly what I'd expected. He tried to make himself the victim. "This is all her doing," he said, pointing at me. "She's been plotting to destroy me since the day Isabella and I got married. She never accepted our relationship, and now she's using the situation to tear us apart." Isabella leaned forward, her voice cutting through his deflection like a blade. "I almost died, David. Our daughter almost died. While you were posting photos on Instagram from yacht parties, I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed with machines monitoring my heartbeat." "You're exaggerating. I'm telling the truth. Something you haven't done once since you walked into this room." David's composure finally cracked completely. "You want the truth? The truth is that being married to you has been suffocating. The constant worry, the emotional demands, the way you question every decision I make. I needed space to think, to figure out how to handle the business problems without dragging you into it. So you decided to drag Tiffany into it instead. Tiffany understands the pressure I'm under. She doesn't make everything about her feelings or create drama over every little thing. The casual cruelty of his words was breathtaking. David was describing his pregnant wife's legitimate concerns about their marriage and her health as drama, while positioning his affair as a reasonable response to stress. Every little thing Isabella repeated, like bleeding during pregnancy, like not being able to reach my husband when I needed medical help, like discovering that our savings accounts had been emptied without my knowledge. I was going to pay it all back once the California deal closed. There was no California deal. Isabella's voice rose for the first time, and I saw tears of rage rather than sadness. You've been lying about everything, David. The business success, the investor meetings, even your sister's pregnancy complications that made you think mine were normal. What are you talking about? You don't have a sister, David. You're an only child. But you told me your sister had bleeding during pregnancy to convince me not to call the doctor when I was having complications. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He'd been caught in such a fundamental lie that even his practiced manipulation couldn't explain it away. I was trying to help you stay calm. Stress is bad for pregnancy outcomes. So you lied about having a sister to prevent me from seeking medical care that might have saved my life. You're twisting everything I say. I'm stating facts, Isabella said coldly. You lied about your family history to manipulate my medical decisions. You stole my money to fund your affair. You abandoned me during a medical emergency to continue your vacation. These aren't interpretations, David. These are facts. Richard chose that moment to slide a document across the table. Mr. Ashford, we need to discuss the custody arrangements for your daughter. My daughter David looked confused by the shift in topic. Your parental rights are being contested, Richard explained, based on your demonstrated pattern of abandonment, financial abuse, and endangerment of both mother and child. You can't take away my parental rights. I'm her father. Being a biological father and being a legal father are different things, I said quietly. Legal fathers don't abandon their pregnant wives to die while they party in Hawaii. I didn't abandon anyone. This is all being blown out of proportion. Isabella pulled out her phone and placed it on the table. I recorded our last phone conversation, David. The one where I was crying and bleeding and begging you to come home, or at least help me figure out what to do. David stared at the phone as if it were a snake. You can't. That's illegal. New York is a one-party consent state, Richard said. Isabella had every right to record a conversation she was participating in. Would you like to hear it? Isabella asked. Would you like this room full of people to listen to you calling your pregnant wife hysterical and needy while she was having a medical emergency? No, David said quickly. That conversation was taken out of context. What context makes abandoning your dying wife acceptable? David had no answer. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, his charm and manipulation had failed him completely. He was facing the unvarnished truth of his actions, and there was no way to spin or minimize the damage he'd caused. Here's what's going to happen. Richard continued spreading out legal documents. Isabella is filing for divorce on grounds of abandonment, adultery, and financial abuse. She's seeking full custody of your daughter with no visitation rights. That's ridiculous. I have rights. You forfeited your rights when you chose your mistress over your family, I said. But there's more. Richard slid another document across the table. This is a civil lawsuit seeking damages for financial fraud, emotional distress, and endangerment. We're asking for complete restitution of stolen funds plus punitive damages. How much? David's voice was barely a whisper. $5 million, Richard said calmly. David laughed, but the sound was bitter and desperate. I don't have $5 million. I don't have $5,000. You've frozen all my accounts, destroyed my business, ruined my reputation. There's nothing left to take. Then you'll spend the rest of your life working to pay it back. Isabella said, every paycheck, every asset, every inheritance you might receive, it will all go toward compensating me for what you stole and the trauma you caused. This is insane. I made mistakes, but I don't deserve to have my entire life destroyed. You don't deserve to have a life, I said quietly, and the words carried all the cold fury I'd been holding back for weeks. You left my daughter to die, David. You stole from her while she was vulnerable and pregnant. You chose your own pleasure over your family's survival. I never meant intent doesn't matter. Results matter. And the result is that you're a man who abandoned his pregnant wife during a medical emergency to continue an affair funded with her money. David looked around the room, desperately seeking some sympathy or support that wasn't there. When his eyes met mine, I saw him finally understand that this wasn't a negotiation or a family dispute that could be resolved with apologies and promises. This was the complete dismantling of his life executed with the same systematic precision that had built my business empire. What do you want from me? He asked finally. Nothing, Isabella said. I want nothing from you ever again. I want you to sign away your parental rights, agree to the financial judgment, and disappear from our lives permanently. And if I don't, then you'll spend the next several years in federal prison for fraud while we pursue the civil case anyway. Richard explained, your choice is between cooperating now or cooperating later from a jail cell. David stared at the papers for a long time, his hands shaking as he read through the terms of his surrender. Finally, he looked up at Isabella with something that might have been genuine emotion. I did love you, he said. I know you don't believe that now, but I did. You loved what I represented. You loved my money, my family connections, the lifestyle I could provide. But you never loved me as a person, because if you had, you couldn't have done what you did. What about her daughter? Don't I get to know my own child? Your daughter will grow up knowing that her mother was strong enough to protect her from a man who abandoned them both. She'll know that some people are worth trusting and others are worth avoiding, and she'll never wonder if her father loved her, because she'll understand that real love requires sacrifice, not selfishness. David signed the papers with tears streaming down his face. Whether from grief, self-pity, or rage, I couldn't tell and didn't care. As he prepared to leave, he turned to me one final time. You won, he said bitterly. Are you satisfied? I studied his defeated expression, his broken posture, his complete comprehension of everything he'd lost. David, I said gently, this was never about winning. This was about protecting my family from someone who proved himself unworthy of their trust. The satisfaction doesn't come from your defeat. It comes from knowing that my daughter and granddaughter will build their lives without you. After David left the conference room, Isabella and I sat in silence for several minutes. The ordeal was finally over. But the emotional weight of what we'd experienced would take time to process. How do you feel? I asked, empty, relieved, angry, grateful. Isabella touched her belly where our granddaughter was growing stronger every day. Mostly I feel free. Free to do what? Free to love her without worrying about him. Free to raise her with the values you taught me instead of the compromises I made trying to save a marriage that was never worth saving. I reached across the table and took her hand. Your daughter is going to be extraordinary, Isabella. She's going to grow up surrounded by women who never accepted less than they deserved. What do you think will happen to David? I considered the question seriously. I think he'll spend the next few years discovering that reputation and relationships can't be rebuilt through charm and manipulation. I think he'll learn that some mistakes have permanent consequences. Do you think he'll ever understand what he did wrong? Men like David rarely achieve that level of self-awareness. They're too invested in seeing themselves as victims of circumstances, rather than architects of their own destruction. Isabella nodded slowly. Then I'm glad our daughter will never have to depend on his understanding or approval for anything. As we left Richard's office that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of completion. David Ashford had been erased from our lives as completely as if he never existed. The legal documents made it official, but the real victory was seeing the strength and clarity in my daughter's eyes. Some endings are painful but necessary. Some battles leave scars that never fully heal. But some fights end with the absolute certainty that you protected what mattered most, and that the people you love will never again be vulnerable to the same threats. David had wanted to be a father without accepting the responsibilities of fatherhood. Instead, he'd become a cautionary tale about the price of selfishness. And my granddaughter would grow up in a world where that was exactly the lesson she needed to learn. 3 months later, on a cold February morning, I received a call that brought everything full circle. Mrs. Barry, this is Detective Sarah Chen with the NYPD. We have David Ashford in custody and he's asking to speak with you. I was in my study reviewing quarterly reports while Isabella napped in the guest bedroom. Her pregnancy was progressing beautifully now. She was glowing with health. The baby was active and strong, and Dr. Martinez had cleared her for light activity as long as she avoided stress. What are the charges? I asked. Violation of the restraining order, harassment, and attempted breaking and entering. He was found trying to climb the fire escape to your daughter's window at the hospital. My blood went cold. Is Isabella safe? She's fine. Hospital security detained him before he reached her floor, but Mrs. Barry, I think you should know he's been living rough for the past few weeks, sleeping in his car, apparently following your daughter's movements. The hospital staff says he's been seen in the parking lot multiple times. I felt the familiar surge of protective fury followed immediately by cold calculation. David's descent had been swift and complete, but apparently it hadn't taught him the lesson I'd hoped it would. I'll be there in an hour, I told Detective Chin. The police station in Midtown was exactly as depressing as expected. Fluorescent lights, industrial carpeting, the smell of coffee and desperation. Detective Chun was a compact woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every variety of human failure. He's been asking for you specifically, she explained as we walked toward the interview rooms. She has information about financial crimes that might interest federal investigators. He's trying to bargain his way out of stalking charges. Seems like it. Though between you and me, the federal case against him is already solid. His cooperation isn't worth much at this point. She led me to a small room with a one-way glass where I could observe David before deciding whether to speak with him. What I saw was devastating in its completeness. The confident, charming man who had married my daughter 3 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he'd been hollowed out from the inside. David sat hunched over the metal table, his unwashed hair hanging in his eyes, wearing clothes that had clearly been slept in multiple times. His hands shook with what looked like caffeine withdrawal or something worse, and his eyes carried the wild, desperate look of someone who'd lost touch with reality. "How long has he been like this?" I asked. The deterioration accelerated after he lost his apartment last month. Apparently, he'd been staying in budget motel, then his car, then various shelters. The staff at the downtown mission says he talks constantly about getting his family back, about explaining himself to people who won't listen. I watched David mumble to himself, practicing what looked like a speech or a conversation. Even through the glass, I could see his lips moving, his hands gesturing as if he were addressing an invisible audience. What kind of information is he claiming to have? Names of other investors who might have been defrauded, details about offshore accounts, that sort of thing. But frankly, the FBI already has most of it from his business partner and the financial records you provided. I studied David's broken form for another minute, feeling an unexpected pang of something that might have been pity. He destroyed himself more thoroughly than I'd ever intended. And while he deserved consequences for his actions, seeing him reduced to this felt almost grotesque. "I'll talk to him," I decided. "But I want you in a room with me." Detective Chin nodded and led me inside. David's head snapped up when I entered, and for a moment his eyes cleared with something that looked like hope. "Amelia," he breathed. "Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. There's so much I need to explain." I took the chair across from him, noting the sour smell of unwashed clothes and the way his hands trembled as he tried to smooth down his hair. "Hello, David. You look wonderful, elegant as always. How is Isabella? How is the baby?" "They're both healthy and safe. No thanks to you." "I know you think I'm a monster, but you have to understand I never meant for any of this to happen. I was in over my head with the business, desperate to find a way to make it work. When Tiffany came along, she seemed like a solution to the stress, not a replacement for my family." I studied his face, seeing the familiar patterns of manipulation even in his diminished state. David was still trying to control the narrative, still positioning himself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own destruction. "David, you attempted to break into Isabella's hospital room. You've been stalking her for weeks. Do you understand how that behavior appears to people? I wasn't stalking her. I was trying to find the right moment to apologize, to explain what really happened. But you've turned everyone against me. The hospital staff, the lawyers, even my own business partners. I haven't turned anyone against you. Your actions did that." "My actions." David's voice rose, and Detective Chin shifted slightly in her chair. "My actions were trying to save a failing business and protect my family from financial ruin. Everything I did was for Isabella and the baby." The delusion was complete. David had rewritten history in his mind, transforming theft and abandonment into noble sacrifice. He genuinely seemed to believe that his affair and financial crimes had been motivated by love rather than selfishness. "David, you stole $600,000 from Isabella's accounts to fund your Hawaiian vacation with another woman. How was that protecting your family?" "I was buying time. The investor meeting in Hawaii was real. I was trying to secure funding that would have saved everything. Tiffany was she was helping me network, introducing me to people who might be interested in the business. Tiffany was a 25-year-old Instagram influencer with no business connections. You don't understand the modern investment landscape. Social media presence matters. Having an attractive woman vouching for your success opens doors." "Stop," I held up my hand, feeling simultaneously disgusted and exhausted by his refusal to accept reality. David, there was no investor meeting. There was no business salvation. You went to Hawaii to have an affair, and you used Isabella's money to pay for it. Everything else is a story you've told yourself to avoid confronting what you actually did. David stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something break behind his eyes. For just an instant, the delusion cracked, and he seemed to see himself clearly. "She almost died," he whispered. "Isabella almost died, and I wasn't there." Yes, the baby could have died too. Yes, because I chose to be with another woman instead of taking care of my pregnant wife. Yes. The clarity lasted perhaps 30 seconds before his face hardened again, the self-protective mechanisms slamming back into place. "But that's not the whole story," he said desperately. "There were extenuating circumstances. Business pressures that you can understand. I was trying to build something that would provide for my family's future." David stopped talking. Something in my voice cut through his rambling. He looked at me with the same expression he had worn during our final meeting in Richard's conference room. The recognition that he was facing someone who couldn't be manipulated or convinced. "I want you to listen very carefully," I continued. "Isabella is going to give birth to your daughter in 6 weeks. That little girl will grow up happy, healthy, and loved. She'll attend the best schools, travel the world, and have every opportunity life can offer. That's wonderful. I want to be part of that. I want to help raise her. She will never know your name. She will never see your face. She will never wonder about the man who provided half her DNA because she'll understand that biology doesn't make someone a father." David's face crumpled. "You can erase me from her life completely. I don't have to erase you, David. You erased yourself when you chose selfishness over sacrifice, pleasure over responsibility, lies over truth. But I'm her father." "No, you're her sperm donor. Fathers don't abandon pregnant mothers. Fathers don't steal from their families. Fathers don't prioritize affairs over emergencies." I stood up, smoothing my coat and gathering my purse. "Detective Chun tells me you're trying to bargain information for reduced charges. I have names, account numbers, details about the offshore funds. Save your breath. The FBI has everything they need to prosecute you and recover the stolen money. Your cooperation isn't worth anything because you're not important enough to be useful as a witness. Then what happens to me?" I paused at the door, looking back at the broken man who had once seemed so confident and charming. "You serve your time, you pay what you owe, and you spend the rest of your life living with the knowledge that you had everything. A beautiful wife, a healthy child on the way, financial security, social respect, and you threw it all away for a few weeks of meaningless pleasure." "Amelia, please." "Goodbye, David. I hope you find some peace with your choices because no one else is going to give it to you." As I left the police station, I felt a profound sense of closure. David's destruction was complete, but more importantly, his threat to my family was permanently neutralized. He was facing federal charges that would likely result in several years in prison, followed by decades of financial obligations that would prevent him from rebuilding any kind of substantial life. But the real victory wasn't his punishment. It was the knowledge that Isabella and the baby would grow up free from his toxic influence, surrounded by people who understood that love required sacrifice and that family meant protection. I called Isabella from the car to let her know that David had been arrested and would no longer be able to harass her. "How did he look?" she asked quietly. "Broken. Completely broken. Do you think he'll ever understand what he did wrong? I think he's too invested in his own victimhood to achieve Real in sight. But it doesn't matter anymore, sweetheart. He can't hurt you or the baby, and that's all that counts." "I dreamed about him last night," Isabella confessed. "Not a romantic dream, but a sad one. I dreamed that he was homeless and alone, and I felt sorry for him. That's because you have a kind heart. But kindness doesn't require you to accept abuse or put yourself in danger. I know it's just, he used to be someone I loved. It's hard to reconcile that person with what he became. Maybe he was always what he became, and love just made you see him differently. Or maybe he was someone decent who made increasingly terrible choices until he destroyed his own character. Either way, the man you loved doesn't exist anymore. And our daughter will know that her mother was strong enough to protect them both from someone who couldn't be trusted with their hearts." That night, as I sat in my study reviewing the legal documents that would finalize David's complete removal from our lives, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. 6 months ago, I'd been a widow trying to rebuild her life after loss. Today, I was a grandmother preparing to welcome a child who would grow up surrounded by the kind of unconditional love and protection that money couldn't buy but power could guarantee. David had meant to take advantage of what he saw as our vulnerability. Instead, he discovered that some families are protected by forces he couldn't imagine or overcome. The war was over, and we had won completely. Now it was time to focus on the future, and the little girl who would soon join our unbreakable circle. Isabella went into labor on a snowy March morning 3 weeks before her due date. I was in the hospital cafeteria buying coffee and Danish pastries for the nursing staff who had taken such excellent care of my daughter during her extended stay when my phone rang with the news I'd been anticipating for weeks. "Mrs. Barry, this is Nurse Rodriguez from Labor and Delivery. Isabella asked me to call you. Her contractions are 5 minutes apart and getting stronger." I abandoned the pastries and was beside Isabella's bed within minutes, finding her breathing through contractions with a focused determination that reminded me powerfully of her father during his most challenging business negotiations. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Ready," she said simply. "I'm ready to meet her." Dr. Martinez arrived shortly afterward, all business and reassuring competence. The labor progressed smoothly. No complications, no drama, just the natural unfolding of the process that would bring my granddaughter into the world. At 3:47 p.m., Victoria Grace Berry took her first breath and announced her arrival with a cry that was both furious and triumphant. She was perfect, 7 lulm 2 O's of indignant infant with Isabella's dark hair and the unmistakable Berry family jawline that suggested she would not be easily intimidated by anyone or anything. "She's beautiful," I whispered, holding my granddaughter for the first time, and feeling my heart expand in ways I hadn't known were possible. "She looks angry," Isabella observed, laughing through tears of exhaustion and joy. "She's a Berry woman," I replied. "Angry is our default setting when we encounter injustice." Dr. Martinez finished her post-delivery checks and pronounced both mother and daughter in excellent health. "You've been through a lot these past few months," she told Isabella. "But this little one is strong and healthy. Whatever challenges you faced during pregnancy, they didn't affect her development." After the medical staff left, and Isabella dozed with Victoria sleeping on her chest, I sat beside the hospital bed and marveled at the perfection of the moment. 6 months ago, I'd found my daughter near death and alone. Today she was a mother holding her healthy child, surrounded by love and protected by resources that would ensure both their futures. David Ashford had no place in this room, no claim on this moment, no connection to the family that had formed despite his efforts to destroy it. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Sentencing hearing scheduled for next month. Federal prosecutors recommending 5 to 7 years. I looked at Victoria's tiny face peaceful in sleep and felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. By the time David was released from prison, Victoria would be old enough to attend school. She would grow up with no memory of his existence, no curiosity about his absence, no sense that anything was missing from her life. "What are you thinking about?" Isabella asked softly. "How complete our family is. How perfect she is. How lucky we are that everything worked out exactly as it should have. Even the horrible parts, especially the horrible parts they taught us who we really are and what we're capable of protecting." Isabella was quiet for a moment, studying Victoria's sleeping face. "I used to worry that I wouldn't be a good mother without a partner to help me. Now I think maybe single motherhood will be a strength rather than a limitation. Why? Because I won't have to compromise my values or second-guess my instincts to accommodate someone else's agenda. Every decision I make will be in Victoria's best interest, not filtered through what's convenient for a marriage that wasn't working anyway." I smiled, seeing in my daughter the same clear-eyed pragmatism that had served our family well for generations. "What about dating? Marriage? Don't you want Victoria to have a father figure? Someday, maybe, but only if I find someone who enhances our lives rather than complicating them. Someone who loves Victoria as much as he loves me. Who understands that we're a package deal and that my daughter's well-being comes first. That's a high standard." "Good. David taught me what happens when you accept less than you deserve. Victoria will grow up watching me refuse to settle for anything that doesn't genuinely improve our lives." Over the following days, as Isabella recovered and we adjusted to life with a newborn, I watched my daughter transform into exactly the kind of mother I'd hoped she would become. Protective but not paranoid, loving but not indulgent, strong enough to make difficult decisions when Victoria's welfare required them. More importantly, I saw no trace of the fearful, isolated woman who had been manipulated into questioning her own judgment. David's psychological abuse had been thorough, but Isabella's recovery was proving even more complete. 2 weeks after Victoria's birth, I received an unexpected phone call from Detective Chin. "Mrs. Barry, I thought you should know David Ashford was found dead in his cell this morning." The news hit me like a physical blow, not because I felt grief for David, but because it felt somehow anticlimactic after everything we'd been through. What happened? He'd been increasingly despondent since the sentencing hearing, according to the prison staff. "Left behind a letter addressed to your daughter. I don't want Isabella to see it." The prison chaplain read it first as part of standard procedure. "He says it's not what you'd expect from a suicide note. More like a business proposal. What do you mean David was trying to negotiate even from prison, claiming he had information about other financial crimes that could benefit Isabella if she agreed to visit him? The chaplain says there was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no genuine apology. Just more attempts at manipulation." I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Even in death, David had remained exactly who he'd always been, a man who saw relationships as transactions and believed charm could substitute for character. What happens to the letter prison policy is to destroy unclaimed correspondence after 30 days. Unless you want us to forward it. Destroy it, I said immediately. David Ashford has nothing to say that my family needs to hear. That evening I sat in Isabella's nursery watching her feed Victoria while trying to decide whether to share the news of David's death. Part of me wanted to protect her from any additional emotional trauma. But another part knew that secrets, even well-intentioned ones, could be corrosive to family trust. Isabella, I have something to tell you about David. She looked up from Victoria's peaceful nursing, her expression immediately alert. He died in prison this morning. Isabella was quiet for a long time, her hand automatically stroking Victoria's soft hair as she processed the information. How do I feel about that? She asked finally. How do you feel about it? Empty. Not sad, not relieved, just empty. Like hearing about the death of someone I used to know a long time ago, but had completely forgotten about. That sounds healthy. Does it? I feel like I should feel something more significant. Grief or anger or at least some sense of closure. Maybe the closure came months ago when you decided to protect Victoria from his influence. Maybe his death is just confirmation that you made the right choice. Isabella nodded slowly. What about Victoria? Will I ever tell her what happened to her biological father? I considered the question carefully. I think you'll tell her the truth when she's old enough to understand it, that her father was someone who couldn't handle the responsibilities of family life, who made choices that hurt people, and who ultimately couldn't live with the consequences of his actions. And if she wants to know more details, then you'll decide what she needs to know based on who she is as a person and what will help her make good decisions in her own life. But Isabella, that conversation is 15 or 20 years away. You don't need to plan every word right now. I want her to understand that her father's failures don't reflect on her worth as a person. She will, because she'll grow up surrounded by people who love her unconditionally and who demonstrate through their actions that family means protection, not exploitation. Victoria finished nursing and fell asleep in Isabella's arms, completely oblivious to the conversation that had just determined how family history would be understood and shared. Looking at my granddaughter's peaceful face, I felt the final piece of this long ordeal click into place. David's death hadn't been tragic or redemptive. It had simply been final. The threat he represented was permanently neutralized, not through revenge or punishment, but through his own inability to live with the reality of who he'd become. Mom, there's something I've been thinking about since Victoria was born. What's that? I want to change her last name legally, not just socially, but officially. I want her to be Victoria Graceberry, with no connection to David at all. Are you sure that's a significant decision? I'm sure David forfeited any claim to her when he abandoned us. I want her to carry forward the Berry family name and values without any confusion about where she belongs. I felt a surge of pride and satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. The Berry family name would continue through my granddaughter, but more importantly, the values that had built our family's success would be passed down to someone who had been protected from the corrupting influence of someone unworthy. Then we'll make it official. I agreed. Victoria Grace Berry. It is. As I left the hospital that night, walking through the same corridors where I'd once sat vigil over Isabella's uncertain recovery, I reflected on the complete transformation of our family's circumstances. 6 months ago, David Ashford had been a threat to our happiness, our security, and our future. Today, he was nothing more than a cautionary tale about the price of selfishness and the importance of character. Victoria would grow up in a world where her mother's strength had been proven under fire, where her grandmother's love came with the kind of protection that money could provide and power could guarantee, and where family meant something unbreakable and permanent. The bloodline would continue stronger and wiser for having survived David's assault. And that, I realized, was the most complete victory possible. 5 years later, I sat in my garden on a perfect spring morning, watching Victoria chase butterflies among the roses, while Isabella worked on her laptop nearby. The scene was so peaceful, so complete, that it was hard to remember the darkness that had once threatened to destroy everything I loved. Victoria was exactly the fierce, intelligent child I'd expected her to become. At 5 years old, she had her mother's thoughtful nature tempered by the Barry family steel that showed itself whenever someone tried to tell her what she couldn't do. Her vocabulary was impressive, her curiosity boundless, and her sense of justice already well developed. Yesterday she'd lectured the neighborhood children about sharing toys with an authority that reminded me powerfully of myself in boardroom negotiations. "Grandmama!" she called, running toward me with a purple butterfly perched improbably on her finger. "Look what I found! That's beautiful, sweetheart. But you know, butterflies need to fly free, don't you?" Victoria studied the butterfly seriously before gently blowing it off her finger and watching it flutter away, like people she observed. People need to fly free, too. That's exactly right. Isabella looked up from her laptop, smiling at her daughter's wisdom. "What are you working on today, baby?" "The foundation paperwork," Isabella replied. "We're launching the financial literacy program next month. The Isabella Barry Foundation for Women's Financial Independence had been my daughter's post-David project, born from her determination to ensure that other women wouldn't fall victim to the kind of financial abuse she'd experienced. What had started as a healing exercise had grown into a significant charitable organization providing education, legal assistance, and emergency support to women trapped in financially abusive relationships. How many women are enrolled in the pilot program? I asked 53, and we have a waiting list of over 200. The foundation's success had been both gratifying and sobering. Proof that Isabella's experience wasn't unique, but also evidence that our work was desperately needed. What about the scholarship program, fully funded for the next 5 years? Thanks to your donation. Isabella smiled at me with a kind of gratitude that made every cent worth it. Victoria will grow up seeing her mother's name on buildings where women learn to protect themselves. I felt a deep satisfaction at the thought. The money David had stolen had been recovered and returned. But the real treasure was watching Isabella transform her pain into purpose, her victimization into empowerment for others. "Grandmama, tell me the story about the butterfly lady," Victoria requested, settling onto my lap with the easy confidence of a child who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. "Which story is that? The one about Mama when she was sick and you made everything better?" Isabella and I exchanged glances. We'd crafted a careful, age-appropriate version of the events surrounding Victoria's birth. A story about a time when Mama was very sick before Victoria was born, and how Grandmama had taken care of everything to make sure they were both safe and healthy. Well, I began settling Victoria more comfortably against my chest. "Once upon a time, your Mama was going to have a baby. But she got very sick and had to go to the hospital. Because my daddy wasn't taking care of her," Victoria added matter-of-factly. Isabella and I had never explicitly discussed David with Victoria, but children have a way of absorbing information from overheard conversations and drawing their own conclusions. That's right. So Grandmama came home from her trip and found Mama in the hospital, and she decided that she was going to make sure you and Mama were always safe and happy. And you did magic to make the bad man go away. Not magic, sweetheart. Just the kind of tools that grown-ups have when they need to protect their families. "Will you teach me those tools when I'm bigger?" I looked down at Victoria's earnest face, seeing in her expression the same determination that had driven 3 generations of Barry women to build lives of security and independence. "I'll teach you everything you need to know to protect yourself and the people you love." I promised. Good. Because when I'm big, I want to help Mama with the butterfly ladies, the ladies who need to learn how to fly free, Victoria explained with a logic that made perfect sense to a 5-year-old mind. Isabella laughed, and the sound was so joyful, so completely different from the terrified woman I'd found in the ICU, that I felt my heart expand with gratitude. "That's exactly what we do, baby," Isabella agreed. "We help women learn how to fly free." That afternoon, after Victoria had been tucked in for her nap, and Isabella had returned to her foundation work, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from our darkest period. David's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also stripped away illusions and revealed truths that might have taken years to discover otherwise. Isabella had learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined that she could survive and thrive without depending on someone else's approval or support. I had rediscovered the fierce, protective instincts that had served me well in business, but had been dormant during my years of comfortable widowhood. Most importantly, Victoria was growing up in a family where love came with protection, where strength was valued over compliance, and where the women around her demonstrated daily that independence and security were not just possible, but expected. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Annual estate review scheduled for next week. Some updates to discuss regarding Victoria's trust." I smiled, thinking about the financial legacy that would be waiting for my granddaughter when she came of age. Unlike Isabella, who had inherited wealth she'd been unprepared to protect, Victoria would grow up understanding money as a tool for freedom and security, not just comfort. She would learn to read financial statements before she learned to drive. She would understand the difference between assets and liabilities, between investments and expenses, between people who loved her and people who loved her money. Most importantly, she would know that her worth wasn't determined by her relationship status, that her security didn't depend on anyone else's good intentions, and that the Barry family women had a long history of taking care of themselves and each other. As evening approached, Isabella joined me on the terrace with glasses of wine and the comfortable silence that had developed between us over the past 5 years. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked eventually. I knew she meant David, though his name was rarely spoken in our house anymore. Sometimes not with regret or sadness, but more like archaeological curiosity, trying to understand how someone could be so completely self-destructive. I dream about him occasionally, not romantic dreams or nightmares, just strange encounters where I try to explain to him what he lost, and he doesn't understand what I'm talking about. Do you think he ever would have understood Isabella considered this seriously? I think he was incapable of seeing other people as real in the way he saw himself as real. We were characters in his story rather than people with our own stories. That kind of narcissism doesn't usually resolve itself. Are you glad he's gone? I'm glad Victoria will never have to navigate a relationship with him. I'm glad I never have to worry about custody battles or him trying to manipulate his way back into our lives. But mostly I just don't think about him anymore. He's become irrelevant to who we are and what we're building. We sat in companionable silence as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the distance I could hear the sounds of traffic and urban life. But here in our protected space, everything felt peaceful and secure. Mom, there's something I've been thinking about. What's that dating marriage, whether I want to try again someday? This was a conversation we'd been dancing around for months. Isabella was only 37, beautiful, successful, and completely in control of her life. It would be natural for her to want companionship, partnership, perhaps even love. And what have you concluded? That I'm not opposed to the idea, but my standards are very different now. I would need someone who understands that Victoria and I are a complete family unit, not a broken situation that needs fixing. That sounds reasonable. I would need someone who sees my independence as attractive rather than threatening. Someone who wants to add to our happiness, rather than be responsible for it. Also, reasonable. And I would need someone who understands that my mother is not just part of the package, she's part of the foundation that our family structure works, because it's based on mutual respect and shared values. I felt a surge of warmth at this declaration. One of my greatest fears after David's betrayal had been that Isabella might overcorrect by pushing away everyone who loved her, including me. Those are high standards, I observed. Good. David taught me what happens when you compromise on the important things. Victoria is watching how I navigate relationships, and I want her to see someone who knows her worth and doesn't settle for less. And if you never find someone who meets those standards... Isabella smiled, and it was the confident expression of a woman who had learned to be complete on her own. Then Victoria and I will continue building an amazing life together, surrounded by people who love us unconditionally. Not everyone needs romantic love to be fulfilled, and settling for the wrong person is worse than being happily single. As if summoned by our conversation, Victoria appeared in the doorway, hair tousled from her nap, and clutching her favorite stuffed elephant. "Mama, Grandmama, can we have pancakes for dinner?" "Pancakes are breakfast food, sweetheart," Isabella replied automatically. "But it's my birthday month," Victoria countered with irrefutable 5-year-old logic. Isabella looked at me with raised eyebrows. "What do you think, Grandmama, pancakes for dinner?" I think I said, scooping Victoria into my arms, that sometimes the best traditions are the ones we make up ourselves. An hour later, we sat around the kitchen table, eating pancakes, shaped like butterflies, while Victoria regaled us with elaborate stories about the adventures of her stuffed elephant in the land of breakfast foods. The scene was so domestic, so perfectly ordinary, that it felt revolutionary after everything we'd been through. This was what David had thrown away. Not just a wife and child, but the daily accumulation of small moments that create a life worth living. The bedtime stories and butterfly pancakes, the scraped knees that needed kissing, and the victories that needed celebrating. He had traded all of this for a few weeks of shallow pleasure with someone who abandoned him the moment his credit card stopped working. As I tucked Victoria into bed that night, she looked up at me with serious eyes. "Grandmama, when I grow up, will I be as strong as you and Mama?" "Stronger," I promised, "because you'll grow up knowing things it took us years to learn. What things? That you're valuable just because you're you, that your feelings matter and your safety matters, that family means people who protect you, not people who hurt you, and that butterflies need to fly free, especially that." Victoria nodded solemnly and closed her eyes, secure in a world where she was loved unconditionally and protected completely. Later that night, as I reviewed the Foundation's quarterly reports and plan for Victoria's trust fund expansion, I felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with legacy. David Ashford had meant to destroy my family's future. Instead, he had taught us lessons about strength, independence, and the importance of protecting what matters most. His betrayal had revealed resources of courage and determination that we might never have discovered otherwise. Victoria would grow up knowing that she came from a line of women who didn't accept less than they deserved, who protected their loved ones with everything they had, and who understood that true security came from their own strength rather than someone else's promises. She would know that family meant something unbreakable and permanent, that love required action as well as words, and that the Berry women had a long tradition of taking care of themselves and each other. The story that had begun with David's cruelty would end with Victoria's strength. The legacy that had been threatened would emerge stronger and more secure than ever before. And David had become exactly what he deserved to be. Irrelevant. Forgotten a cautionary tale about the price of choosing selfishness over love. I raised my glass of wine to the portrait of my late husband that hung above the fireplace in my study. "We did it, darling," I whispered. "We protected what matters most." In the silence that followed, I could almost hear his voice responding with the words he'd always used when we'd successfully navigated a difficult challenge. "Well done, my love. Well done." The butterfly ladies would continue to learn how to fly free. Victoria would grow up strong and protected, and the Berry family legacy would endure for generations to come. Some stories end with revenge. The best ones end with love triumphant and family stronger than ever before. Ours was definitely one of the best ones, and that beautiful souls is how I learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to reveal who they really are. David showed us exactly who he was when he thought we were powerless to respond. But he also showed Victoria and me who we were when everything we loved was threatened, and we were magnificent. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever had to protect someone you love from someone who claimed to love them, remember this. Your instincts are valid. Your protective fury is justified, and your family is worth fighting for with everything you have. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because every woman deserves to remember that she comes from a long line of survivors, fighters, and protectors. Share this story with someone who needs to remember her own strength. Until next time, this is Amelia Berry reminding you that legacy isn't just what you leave behind. It's what you protect while you're here.